The blistering August sun beat down mercilessly on Theresa Kincaid as she stood among 5 other women on the crude wooden auction platform, her wrists bound with coarse rope that chafed her delicate skin. In the frontier town of Silverton, Colorado, 1878, she had become nothing more than merchandise, a mail-order bride whose ship had sailed straight into a nightmare. 200 for the blonde one with the green eyes, a voice called from the crowd of unshaven men who had gathered for what was being called a bride auction, though it resembled nothing more than a livestock sale. Theresa fought back tears as the man who had arranged this horror, a grotesque individual named Silas Mercer, yanked her forward by the rope. "This one's educated, can read, write, and keep your books. Fine breeding stock, too." The words made her stomach turn. She had left Boston with such hope after answering an advertisement for a respectable rancher seeking a wife. Instead, she'd been met at the train station by Mercer, who promptly informed her that her intended husband had died, but not to worry, he would take care of her. His idea of care had been to lock her in a room with other deceived women until today's auction. At 22, Theresa had believed she could forge a new life in the West after her parents' deaths left her penniless. Now she stood trembling, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins, her once fine blue traveling dress stained with dust and tears. "I'll start the bidding at 300, Mercer announced, his voice carrying across the dusty street. The crowd grew louder, and Theresa closed her eyes, unable to look at the sea of leering faces. She heard numbers being called out, each higher than the last, and her heart sank further with each bid. 500, called a gruff voice near the back. 550, countered another. 700, came the response, firm and clear. A murmur swept through the crowd. $700 was an extraordinary sum. 700 going once. Mercer seemed delighted by the high price. 700 going twice. $1,000. The voice was quiet, but carried authority that silenced the crowd instantly. Theresa's eyes flew open, searching for the source. A tall figure moved forward, the crowd parting before him. He wore a dark duster that was coated with trail dust, and a wide-brimmed hat shaded his face. As he approached the platform, he pushed the hat back, revealing piercing blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. "Yorke Xavier," Mercer said, his voice suddenly respectful and perhaps a little fearful. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Evidently," the man replied coldly. 1,000 for the lady, and the rest of them too. He gestured to the other terrified women. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "This is business, Xavier. These women have debts to pay." "Debts they never incurred," Yorke replied, his voice remaining steady even as his eyes hardened. 1,000 for this woman, and I'll take the rest of them off your hands for another 1,000. The crowd muttered. This was unheard of. "That's not how this works," Mercer began. In one fluid motion, Yorke's hand moved to his hip where a revolver rested. He didn't draw it, merely let his fingers rest on the handle. "I believe it is now." Theresa held her breath. No one moved. "Fine," Mercer spat finally. 2,000 for the lot. Yorke reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. He counted out the bills deliberately, then handed them to Mercer. "They're papers." Mercer reluctantly pulled several folded documents from his vest pocket and thrust them at Yorke. "Cut them loose," Yorke commanded. When Mercer hesitated, Yorke reached for a knife at his belt. "I said, cut them loose." With a scowl, Mercer sliced through the ropes binding the women's wrists. Theresa rubbed her raw skin, watching Yorke warily. Had she been saved, or merely purchased by a different kind of monster? Yorke addressed the women gently. "Ladies, you're free to go wherever you please. There's a stagecoach leaving for Denver tomorrow morning. I've arranged for your passage." He handed each woman an envelope. "This should help you get established somewhere safe." The women stared at him in disbelief. One began to sob with relief. Yorke turned to Theresa last. "Miss, if you'll allow me, I'd like to speak with you privately." She hesitated, clutching the envelope he had given her. "Why?" "Because," he said quietly, "your letter was addressed to my brother." The revelation struck Theresa like a physical blow. "Your brother? The man I was to marry?" Yorke nodded grimly. "Thomas Xavier. He died 3 months ago in a riding accident. I only learned of his arrangements for a bride last week when I returned from a cattle drive to Kansas. His jaw tightened. By then, Mercer had already intercepted you. They walked away from the dispersing crowd toward a small cafe at the end of the dusty street. Theresa was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance as they entered the establishment, but Yorke seemed not to notice or care as he led her to a table in the corner. A waitress approached, and Yorke ordered coffee for them both, along with a full meal for Theresa, who suddenly realized she was famished after days of meager rations under Mercer's care. "I apologize for what you've endured," Yorke said once the waitress had gone. "Mercer will be dealt with, I assure you." "You saved us," Theresa said, studying him. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of sun and wind rather than age. "No one should be treated as property," he said firmly, "especially not someone my brother chose as a wife." The food arrived, and Theresa ate carefully despite her hunger, mindful of her manners even in her disheveled state. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "That's your decision, Miss Kincaid. The money in that envelope will get you back east if that's what you want." He paused. Or, she prompted when he didn't continue. "My brother's homestead sits empty. It's a good piece of land with a decent house. He'd already prepared it for a wife." Yorke seemed uncomfortable now. "I don't mean to presume, but if you still want the life you came west for, the land is yours. I signed it over when I settled with Mercer." Theresa stared at him. "You're giving me your brother's property?" "It seems right," he said simply. "You came all this way for a new life. Doesn't seem fair you should be cheated of it." "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Yorke looked out the window, his profile strong against the late afternoon light. "My brother wrote to me about you. Said you were brave to come out here on your own. Said he was lucky to have found someone willing to take a chance on a hard life for the promise of something better." He turned back to her. "I respect that kind of courage." Theresa felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd fought on the auction platform. "I don't know what to say. You don't need to decide now. Rest tonight. I've arranged a room for you at the hotel, a proper room with a lock." His mouth quirked in what might have been a hint of a smile. "Tomorrow you can take the stage to Denver, or—" He hesitated. "Or I can take you to see the homestead. Your choice." After Yorke escorted her to the hotel and ensured she was comfortable, Theresa sat on the edge of the bed, turning the envelope in her hands. Inside was more money than she'd ever held enough to start over anywhere, yet something about Yorke Xavier intrigued her. He was nothing like the refined men of Boston society, but there was an integrity to him that she found compelling, and hadn't she come west, seeking something different? The next morning, she made her decision. Yorke was waiting in the hotel lobby, hat in hand. He straightened when he saw her descend the stairs. Freshly washed and wearing a dress the hotel proprietor's wife had lent her. "I'd like to see the homestead," she said without preamble. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. He merely nodded and offered his arm. "It's about 10 miles out of town." The ride in his wagon was mostly silent. Theresa watched the landscape change from the dusty streets of Silverton to rolling grasslands dotted with stands of pine and aspen. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding traces of snow despite the August heat. "It's beautiful," she said finally. Yorke glanced at her. "It can be harsh too. Winters are long, springs are wet. Summers can burn you up." "Are you trying to discourage me, Mr. Xavier?" That hint of a smile appeared again. "Just being honest. This country doesn't suffer fools or the unprepared." "I'm neither," she said with more confidence than she felt. "No," he agreed. "I don't believe you are." They crested a small hill, and Yorke reined in the horses. Below them lay a valley with a creek running through it. Near the water stood a cabin larger than Theresa had expected, with a barn and corral beside it. A small garden plot was visible, though it looked untended. "That's it," Yorke said quietly. "My brother built it himself over 4 years." As they approached, Theresa could see the care that had gone into the construction. The cabin was made of solid logs, the chinking between them neat and well-maintained. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, and there were actual glass windows, a luxury in this remote place. Yorke helped her down from the wagon and led her to the door. He hesitated before opening it. "No one's been inside since Thomas died, except me when I came to check on things last week." The interior was surprisingly spacious. A main room contained a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and shelves lined with books. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom. Everything was coated with a fine layer of dust, but otherwise orderly. "He was preparing for you," Yorke said, pointing to a new rocking chair by the fire and curtains hung at the windows. Said a home needed a woman's touch to be complete. Theresa ran her fingers over the back of the rocking chair, emotion welling within her. She'd exchanged several letters with Thomas Xavier, finding him thoughtful and kind. His death saddened her, even though they'd never met. "My place is about 2 miles east," Yorke said, breaking into her thoughts. "Close enough if you need help, far enough for privacy." She turned to him. "You live nearby?" "We came out west together, Thomas and I. Both claimed land. His was always the prettier piece." He looked around the cabin. He was the one with an eye for beauty. There was something in his tone that made Theresa study him more carefully. "You miss him." "Every day," he acknowledged. He was 3 years younger, but sometimes seemed the wiser one. They spent the afternoon at the homestead, with Yorke showing her the barn, the spring house where food could be kept cool, and the garden that could be revived with care. He explained about the creek that never ran dry, even in drought years, and pointed out the best places for hunting and gathering berries. As the sun began to lower, he asked, "So what do you think, Miss Kincaid? Could you make a life here?" Theresa looked around at the valley, now golden in the late afternoon light. "I believe I could," she said softly. "But I know nothing about ranching or farming." "You'd learn. People do." He hesitated. "And I'd help, if you wanted." She raised an eyebrow. "Why would you do that?" "Because my brother would have wanted it," he said simply. "And because no one should face this country alone." As they rode back to town in the fading light, Theresa felt a tentative peace settling over her. The horrors of the previous day seemed more distant. Perhaps this unexpected turn could lead to the new beginning she'd sought after all. Yorke arranged for her to stay another night at the hotel while she made final preparations. The following morning, he arrived with supplies: food, seeds for the garden, tools, and other necessities. "You've thought of everything," she remarked as they loaded the wagon. "Just the basics," he replied. "We can get more from town as needed." The word "we" didn't escape her notice, but she didn't comment on it. Their arrangement remained unclear. He was helping her establish herself on his brother's homestead, out of a sense of duty, nothing more. Yet, as they worked together over the next few days, cleaning the cabin and preparing the garden for new planting, Theresa found herself watching Yorke when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness she found reassuring after the chaos of recent events. On the third day, as they took a break from their labors to eat lunch on the porch, Theresa finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why aren't you married, Mr. Xavier?" If the direct question surprised him, he didn't show it. "Never found the time," he said, then seemed to reconsider the flippant answer. "Truth is, I was always moving. Cattle drives, hunting expeditions. Thomas was the settler. I was the wanderer. And now?" He looked out over the valley. "Now, I'm thinking there might be value in staying put." That evening, as Yorke prepared to ride back to his own homestead, he hesitated by his horse. "Will you be all right alone?" he asked. Theresa nodded, though the thought of the empty cabin at night made her nervous. "I'll be fine. You've shown me how to use the shotgun if needed." "I'll come by tomorrow," he promised. And Theresa. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Lock the door." She watched him ride away, a silhouette against the sunset, before going inside and securing the door as instructed. The cabin suddenly seemed very large and very quiet. That night, as she lay in the bed that had been prepared for a bride who never arrived, Theresa contemplated her situation. She was alone in a strange land, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. Yet somehow, she wasn't afraid, at least not of Yorke. He had shown nothing but respect since rescuing her from Mercer's auction block. The days fell into a pattern. Yorke would arrive in the morning, help with whatever tasks needed doing, and leave before dark. They worked side by side, repairing fences, tending the garden, making the homestead livable again. Theresa learned quickly. She had always been intelligent and adaptable, qualities that had prompted her to answer Thomas's advertisement in the first place. Now she applied that same determination to learning the skills of frontier life. 2 weeks after her arrival, a summer thunderstorm swept through the valley. Yorke was helping Theresa mend a hole in the barn roof when the first drops fell. "We need to get inside," he said, gathering the tools. "These storms can turn dangerous fast." They barely made it to the cabin before the skies opened. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the very walls. Theresa jumped at a particularly loud crack. "It's just sound," Yorke said gently. "The cabin's solid." She nodded, embarrassed by her reaction. "I know. In Boston, I loved watching storms from my bedroom window. But here, everything feels so much more immediate." "That's the West for you," he agreed, moving to build a fire against the sudden chill the rain had brought. "Everything's more immediate, more real." As the storm raged outside, they sat before the growing fire, talking more freely than they had before. Yorke told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with Thomas after the war, about their early struggles and eventual success in establishing their ranches. Theresa shared stories of her life in Boston, her parents' deaths from influenza that had left her with debts she couldn't pay, and her decision to become a mail-order bride. "It wasn't desperation," she explained, watching the flames. "Or not only that, I wanted something different. Something more authentic than the life I was living." "And is this authentic enough for you?" Yorke asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. She smiled, meeting his eyes. "Certainly no one could call it artificial." The storm continued into the evening, making it impossible for Yorke to return to his own homestead. "I'll sleep in the barn," he offered. "Don't be ridiculous," Theresa replied. "It's leaking, as we well know since we were just mending it. You can sleep here by the fire." He looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "If you're certain it's proper." "I think we're beyond such concerns out here," she said practically. "Besides, after what you saved me from, I trust you completely." The simple statement seemed to affect him deeply. He looked away, focusing on the fire. "I'll try to deserve that trust," he said quietly. That night, with the storm still drumming on the roof, Theresa lay awake in the bedroom, aware of Yorke's presence in the next room. There was something comforting about knowing he was there, something that went beyond mere physical security. In the morning, she found him already awake, cooking breakfast. The domesticity of the scene struck her, this tall, capable man standing at her stove, his sleeves rolled up, his hair still mussed from sleep. "I hope you don't mind," he said when he noticed her watching. "Seemed the least I could do for the hospitality." "I don't mind at all," she replied, coming to help him. They worked together easily, moving around each other as if they had been doing it for years instead of weeks. As summer gave way to early fall, the routine continued, but with subtle changes. Yorke stayed for dinner more often. Sometimes they read together in the evenings. He had discovered she loved books as much as he did. Occasionally he brought his guitar and played quiet tunes as darkness fell. Neither of them acknowledged the shifting nature of their relationship, but Theresa felt it in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the careful distance he still maintained, even as they grew closer in other ways. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Yorke finally spoke of what had been unspoken between them. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice careful. "Winter will be here before we know it." Theresa nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the cooling air. "I've been preparing as you suggested. The root cellar is nearly full, and I've put up preserves from the garden." "You've done well," he acknowledged. "Better than most who come out here with no experience." He paused. "But winter is hard, lonely." She turned to look at him, waiting. "I've been wondering if—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "That is, I was thinking it might be easier if we faced it together." Her heart quickened. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Xavier?" He met her eyes directly. "I'm suggesting marriage, Miss Kincaid, a partnership. I know it's not what you came west expecting, and I'm not Thomas." "No," she interrupted gently. "You're not Thomas. I never knew Thomas, not really. I knew his letters." She reached out hesitantly and touched his hand. "I know you." Something in his expression changed, softened. "Is that a yes?" "It's a— Tell me more about this partnership you're proposing." she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. He turned his hand to clasp hers. Equal shares in both properties. Your knowledge and intelligence combined with my experience out here. A home that's truly a home, not just a place to sleep between work days. He hesitated. And companionship, in whatever form you're comfortable with. The careful phrasing of that last part touched her. Even in proposing marriage, he was giving her space to define the terms. And what about love? She asked quietly. Yorke's grip on her hand tightened slightly. I can't promise I already love you the way a man should love his wife on their wedding day, he said honestly. But I can promise that I respect you, admire you, and find myself thinking about you every moment we're apart. If that's a foundation for love, then I believe it will grow. His honesty moved her more than flowery declarations would have. I think that's the most genuine proposal a woman could hope for, she said. Is that a yes? He asked again, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Theresa considered the man before her so different from what she had imagined for herself, yet somehow exactly what she needed. Yes, she said simply. It's a yes. The relief and happiness that transformed his face made her certain of her decision. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Thank you for taking a chance on me, he said softly. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through Silverton. The ceremony was simple, held in the town's small church with only a few of Yorke's friends as witnesses. Theresa wore a new dress that Yorke had insisted on purchasing for her, though she'd protested the expense. A bride should have a proper dress, he'd said firmly, even out here. As they exchanged vows, Theresa found herself studying this man, who was becoming her husband. There was still so much she didn't know about him, but she was certain of his fundamental decency, his quiet strength, and his commitment to doing what was right. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Yorke hesitated before leaning in to kiss her. It was their first kiss, brief and gentle, but with an underlying current that hinted at deeper feelings not yet expressed. They returned to the homestead, their homestead now, as the sun was setting. Yorke had spent the previous days moving some of his belongings from his property, though they had decided to make Theresa's cabin their primary residence since it was the larger and more comfortable of the two. That evening, as they ate the wedding dinner Yorke had arranged, with food prepared by the hotel restaurant and brought out earlier, a new shyness fell between them. The reality of their changed relationship seemed to have suddenly dawned on them both. I can sleep in the other room, Yorke offered as they cleared the dishes. Until you're comfortable with more. Theresa appreciated his consideration, but shook her head. We're married now. I don't want to begin with distance between us. Their wedding night was a revelation to Theresa. Yorke was gentle and patient, guiding her through unfamiliar territory with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt a sense of rightness that confirmed her decision. All right? He asked quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. More than all right, she assured him, resting her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. As fall deepened into winter, Theresa discovered the truth of Yorke's warnings about the harsh season. Snow piled high around the cabin, sometimes trapping them inside for days. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. Despite the fire, they kept burning. Yet there was a special intimacy to those winter days and nights. They read to each other by lamplight, played cards, talked for hours about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Yorke taught her to play the guitar, laughing at her frustration when her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Most importantly, they learned each other's bodies and hearts, discovering the rhythms that pleased them both and the quiet moments that deepened their connection. By the time the first hints of spring appeared, tiny green shoots pushing through the melting snow, Theresa knew with certainty that what had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into genuine love. She told Yorke one evening as they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. I love you, she said simply. I thought you should know. He was silent for so long that she began to worry she'd spoken too soon. Then he tightened his arm around her and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I've loved you since that day in the storm, he admitted. Maybe before. Just took a while to recognize it for what it was. Spring brought new activities and challenges, They worked together to expand the garden, repair winter damage to the buildings, and care for the new calves born to Yorke's small herd of cattle. Theresa discovered she had a talent for animal husbandry, particularly with the horses Yorke raised. "You have a gentle hand," he commented, watching her work with a nervous colt. "They trust you." "As I trust them," she replied. "Animals know when you respect them." One warm May morning, as Theresa was collecting eggs from the chicken coop, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She steadied herself against the coop wall, waiting for it to pass. It wasn't the first such episode in recent weeks. That evening she shared her suspicion with Yorke. "I think I might be with child." His response was everything she could have hoped for. Joy, concern, tenderness all flashed across his face before he gathered her carefully into his arms. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she admitted, "but the signs are there." He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." The pregnancy was confirmed by the town doctor during their next trip into Silverton. Yorke became even more protective, insisting Theresa rest more and let him handle the heavier chores. She complied to a point, but refused to be treated as an invalid. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him, "many of them while working fields or tending homes far more primitive than ours." "None of them were my wife," he replied, but he did allow her more freedom after that, though he watched her like a hawk. As summer progressed and her condition became more obvious, they began preparing for the baby's arrival. Yorke built a cradle, crafting it with meticulous care from wood he selected specifically for its beauty and strength. Theresa sewed tiny garments, each stitch a testament to her growing love for the child she had yet to meet. They were sitting on the porch one evening, enjoying the cooler air after a hot day, when a rider appeared on the road leading to their homestead. Yorke tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from reach. As the rider drew closer, Theresa gasped. "It's Mercer!" Yorke stood, positioning himself between Theresa and the approaching figure. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Silas Mercer reined in his horse at a safe distance, his face twisted in a malevolent grin. "Well, well," he called, "if it isn't the gallant rescuer and his purchased bride." "You're not welcome here, Mercer," Yorke said evenly. "Ride on." Mercer ignored him, his eyes fixed on Theresa. "Settled in nicely, I see. Breeding already." His tone made the natural state sound obscene. Yorke's voice hardened. "I won't tell you again. Ride on." "Or what?" Mercer challenged, dismounting. "You ruined a profitable business for me, Xavier. Cost me my reputation in Silverton. Had to move my operations north." His hand hovered near his gun. "I've been thinking about how to repay you for that kindness." Theresa stood, one hand protectively over her swollen belly. "Mr. Mercer, whatever grievance you have with my husband, surely it can be settled without violence." Mercer laughed harshly. "Listen to her, all proper-like. Wasn't so proper when I had her on that auction block, was she?" Yorke moved so quickly that Theresa barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing on the porch, the next he had Mercer by the throat, pressed against a post. "You speak to or about my wife with anything less than absolute respect," Yorke said, his voice deadly quiet, "and they'll find pieces of you across 3 counties. Mercer's face reddened as he struggled for breath. Yorke released him abruptly, stepping back as the man gasped and coughed. "You're insane," Mercer wheezed. "No," Yorke replied calmly. "Just very clear about my priorities. Now get on your horse and ride away. Don't stop until you're out of Colorado territory." "This isn't over," Mercer threatened, but he was already backing toward his horse. "It is," Yorke assured him, "because if I ever see you again, near my family or anywhere else, I won't be as charitable as I'm being today." They watched Mercer ride away, dust billowing behind him. Only when he was out of sight did Yorke turn to Theresa, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was shaking. "He can't hurt us now, can he?" "No," Yorke said firmly, leading her back inside. "He's a coward at heart. He won't be back." That night, as they lay in bed, Theresa nestled against Yorke's side, his hand resting protectively on her belly where their child occasionally kicked or shifted. "What you did today," she said softly, "confronting Mercer like that." "I'm sorry if I frightened you," he replied. But men like him only understand one language. She shook her head slightly. You didn't frighten me. You made me feel safe. She placed her hand over his. Our child is fortunate to have such a father. He was silent for a moment. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted finally. A wife, a child on the way, a true home. He turned to look at her in the dim light. When I saw you on that platform last summer, something inside me knew. Even before I realized you were Thomas's intended, I knew I had to help you. And now? She asked. Now I think whatever fate or providence brought you to this valley, he said, and into my life. Their son was born in late October, a sturdy, healthy boy they named James Thomas Xavier. James for Theresa's father, and Thomas for the brother whose death had inadvertently brought them together. Yorke proved to be a devoted father, as attentive and gentle with his son as he was with his wife. He would walk the floor with the baby when he was fussy, allowing Theresa to rest, and showed remarkable patience during the challenging early weeks of parenthood. As winter once again blanketed the valley in white, the Xavier family settled into a new routine centered around little James. Their cabin, always comfortable, now truly felt like a home filled with a baby's cries and laughter. With lullabies and whispered conversations as they marveled over their son's tiny fingers and toes. One snowy evening, as Theresa nursed James by the fire, while Yorke read aloud from one of their favorite books, she was struck by the completeness of her happiness. This life, so different from anything she had imagined in Boston, had given her everything she hadn't known she needed. Yorke, she said, interrupting his reading, do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if Thomas had lived, if Mercer hadn't intercepted me, if you hadn't come to Silverton that day? He closed the book, considering her question. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I look at you and James, and I can't imagine any other path that would have led me here to this moment. He moved to sit beside her on the settee, gently stroking his sleeping son's head. This is where I was meant to be. With you. Theresa leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the strength that had first drawn her to him, now tempered by the tenderness she had discovered within him. I came west looking for a new beginning, she said softly. I never dreamed it would bring me so much more. Yorke pressed a kiss to her temple. We've only just begun, Theresa. There's a lifetime ahead of us. As the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside their windows, Theresa Xavier held her family close and knew that her husband was right. The auction block that had once represented her darkest moment had, through Yorke's intervention, become the foundation for her greatest joy. He had indeed bought her freedom, and together, they had built a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. Spring arrived again, bringing with it James's first attempts at crawling, and Theresa's growing confidence as both mother and rancher's wife. She had become adept at managing the household accounts, often suggesting improvements that impressed Yorke with their practicality. You have a head for business, he commented one evening as they reviewed their finances. The winter had been harsh, but they had weathered it well, even managing to put aside a small surplus. My father was a merchant, she reminded him. I used to help him with his books before. She trailed off, the memory of her parents' deaths still painful, despite the time that had passed. Yorke covered her hand with his. He'd be proud of you. As James grew from infant to toddler, his personality emerged strong-willed like his father, curious like his mother. He tottered around the cabin and yard, exploring everything within reach, kept safe by the watchful eyes of his parents. Their second anniversary approached, and with it, news that brought both joy and concern. Theresa was expecting again. Another baby, Yorke said when she told him, his face lighting up before quickly shifting to worry. But James is still so young. Will it be too much for you? She smiled, touching his cheek. Many women have children close together, especially out here. We'll manage. He pulled her into a gentle embrace. We'll more than manage. We'll thrive. That fall, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, named for their mothers. She was smaller than James had been, but equally determined. With a cry that could wake the entire valley, Yorke joked. With two small children, life became more challenging, but also richer. Yorke built an addition to the cabin, creating a proper bedroom for the children and more space for their growing family. As the years passed, the Xavier homestead prospered. Yorke's cattle herd grew, as did his reputation for breeding excellent horses. Theresa started a small side business, selling preserves and baked goods in Silverton, using recipes she'd brought from Boston, but adapted to Western ingredients. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. Sarah, 3 years younger, was a whirlwind of energy with chestnut hair like Theresa's and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. When James was 8 and Sarah 5, Theresa gave birth to their third child, another son they named William. By then, their homestead had expanded significantly. They employed 2 hands to help with the cattle and horses, and had built a larger home, a short distance from the original cabin, which now served as a guest house for the occasional visitor. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching their children play in the twilight, Yorke turned to Theresa with an expression that took her back to their early days together. "I've been thinking," he began, echoing the words he'd used when proposing marriage years before. "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. He smiled, taking her hand in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Do you ever miss it? The East, civilization." The question surprised her. "What brings this on?" He shrugged slightly. "James will be ready for more schooling soon, better than what the town can provide." Theresa considered this. Education was important to them both. They had taught their children to read and write early, and their home contained more books than most in the territory. "Are you suggesting we leave?" she asked carefully. "Not permanently," he clarified quickly. "Maybe winters in Denver, where the children could attend proper schools. We could afford it now." She looked out at their property, the fields and pastures, the barns and corrals, all built through their joint efforts over the past decade. "This is our home," she said simply. "Always," he agreed, "but I don't want our children limited by geography. Especially not if they have ambitions that require education beyond what we can provide here." His thoughtfulness touched her deeply. This man, who many might dismiss as a simple rancher, had depths that continued to surprise her even after years of marriage. "Let's discuss it with the children," she suggested. "See how they feel about spending part of the year in the city." Yorke nodded, clearly pleased with her openness to the idea. "I've already looked into a house we might lease. Nothing grand, but comfortable, near a good school." They implemented the plan that winter, spending January through March in Denver. The children thrived in the school environment, though they missed the freedom of the ranch. Theresa found she enjoyed certain aspects of city life: the lectures, the libraries, the occasional concert, while Yorke seemed content as long as his family was happy. This pattern continued for several years, giving the Xavier children the best of both worlds, the solidity and work ethic developed on the ranch combined with the broader education and cultural exposure of the city. As James approached 16, he began to express interest in attending university in the East, perhaps even Harvard, where Theresa's father had studied. The possibility both excited and frightened her. Her firstborn, so far away. "He has your intelligence," Yorke said when they discussed it privately, "and my stubbornness. He'll do well." "But Boston is so far," she worried. "Farther than Silverton was from Boston when you made that journey?" he asked gently. The reminder of her own youthful courage helped put things in perspective. "You're right," she acknowledged. "We can't hold him back out of fear." James did go east to study, his letters home full of experiences and ideas that sometimes made Theresa nostalgic for the world she had left behind. Yet when he returned for holidays, his appreciation for the ranch and the life they had built reassured her that he hadn't lost touch with his roots. Sarah, as she grew, showed a different kind of intelligence, practical, focused on the land and animals. By 15, she could ride as well as any hand on the place, and had a special way with the horses that even Yorke admired. "She'll run this ranch someday," he predicted proudly. William, their youngest, was still finding his path equally at home, with books or on horseback, interested in everything from geology to poetry. "A Renaissance man in the making," James teased during one of his visits home from university. When James graduated and announced his intention to study law, Theresa and Yorke supported him fully. Though privately, Yorke admitted to a hope that their son might eventually bring his skills back west. "The territories need good lawyers," he said, "especially ones who understand both worlds." One crisp October morning, as Theresa and Yorke rode together across their property, something they still did regularly. Despite the passage of years, he surprised her by stopping at a particular overlook. From this vantage point, they could see not only their own lands, but also the original homestead, where they had begun their life together. 20 years, he said quietly. Theresa knew immediately what he meant. It had been 20 years since that day in Silverton when he had purchased her freedom from Mercer's auction block. 20 years, she echoed, reaching for his hand. They were both in their 50s now, with strands of silver in their hair and lines of experience etched on their faces. Yet, when he looked at her, Theresa still saw the same warmth and admiration that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Any regrets?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in the question that reminded her of their early days. She considered the full measure of their life together, the challenges they had faced, the children they had raised, the love that had grown from uncertain beginnings to become the bedrock of her existence. "Not one," she said with absolute conviction. "Every step of the journey brought me exactly where I was meant to be." He leaned over and kissed her, a gesture that still held the power to quicken her heartbeat after all their years together. "I thank God every day for bringing you west," he said, "even by such a difficult path." As they rode home, side by side, as they had traveled through life, Theresa reflected on the remarkable journey from terrified captive to confident matriarch of a thriving family. Yorke had not only bought her freedom that day in Silverton, he had given her the space and support to discover her own strength, to build a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met. The auction block that had once represented her darkest hour had become merely the first step on a path to profound joy. In saving her, Yorke Xavier had found his own salvation, and together they had created a legacy that would endure long after them, in their children and in the land they had nurtured with such care. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching another spectacular western sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Theresa rested her head on Yorke's shoulder, exactly as she had done countless times over their years together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his arm around her as comfortable and necessary as her next breath. "The very first sunset we watched together," she replied. "When you first suggested we might make a life together." "Best proposition I ever made," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Best one I ever accepted," she agreed. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Theresa Xavier knew with absolute certainty that the frightened young woman who had stood trembling on an auction platform could never have imagined the fullness of the life that lay ahead of her, a life made possible by one man's courage and compassion, and sustained by a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. Her journey west had been the greatest risk she had ever taken, but as Yorke's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, she knew it had also been her greatest reward.